Billionaire falls in love with a black nurse who made his grandfather smile before he passed away. The severance package is non-negotiable. Security will escort you out. The words left Julian Vance's mouth with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel, each syllable slicing through the man's desperate pleas. He didn't even watch the longtime executive being led away. His focus was already on the next line of the quarterly report, a landscape of black and red that was more real to him than the lives he rearranged. At 36, Julian wasn't just the CEO of Vance Legacy Holdings. He was its unfeeling, hyper-efficient engine. Then, his private line, the one that never rang, buzzed with a low, insistent hum. The caller ID read, Serenity Gardens. A cold dread, foreign and unwelcome, washed over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. Mr. Vance, this is Nurse Ramirez, calling about your grandfather Arthur. The voice was calm, professional, but Julian's hand tightened around his phone. His grandfather. The only person who ever called him Jules, the only one whose eyes didn't reflect the glint of his net worth. Guilt was a poor investment, a liability on the balance sheet of his life, yet it surged through him like a hostile takeover. I'm clearing my schedule, he heard himself say, his own voice sounding distant. He drove the Aston Martin himself, a sleek black Predator, slicing through the city's concrete canyons, feeling increasingly absurd as the gleaming skyscrapers of the financial district gave way to the quiet, tree-lined streets of the suburbs. The car, a symbol of his dominion, felt like an alien spacecraft here. He parked it, a silent testament to a world of steel and glass, in front of the warm brick and ivy of Serenity Gardens. He expected hushed hallways, the scent of antiseptic, the slow, somber tick of life winding down. Instead, what greeted him was the sound of laughter. Genuine, hearty laughter. His grandfather's laughter. He followed the sound to a meticulously kept garden, and the sight stopped him cold. There was Arthur. His once imposing frame now stooped over a walker, but his face was lit with a joy Julian hadn't seen in a decade. And beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, was a young woman in simple blue scrubs. Her name, he would soon learn, was Elena Morales. She wasn't the kind of woman who frequented his world. There was no calculated perfection, no designer label. Her beauty was in the life that radiated from her, in the crinkle of her eyes, as she laughed at one of Arthur's stories, in the effortless way she moved as if she were rooted to the very earth of the garden. She was talking about tomato seedlings. Her hands animated her dark, curly hair, escaping its practical ponytail. And then Arthur looked up and saw him. The light in his eyes grew even brighter. Jules, my boy. Elena turned, and for the first time her eyes met Julian's. There was no flicker of recognition, no awe, no calculation. Her warm smile didn't falter, but it changed. It became professional, polite, and in that subtle shift, Julian felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child facing his father's disapproval. He felt utterly and completely seen, and he knew with a certainty that shook him that he had been found wanting. He forced a smile that felt foreign on his face and closed the distance, the expensive leather of his shoes silent on the stone path. Grandpa, he said, his voice a little too stiff as he embraced the old man's frail shoulders. You're looking well. Arthur beamed, patting his back. It's the company, Jules. I was just telling Ellie here about the time we nearly sank that boat on Lake Whitney. Elena Morales offered a polite, professional smile. You never told me your grandson was an outdoorsman, Arthur. Her use of his grandfather's first name was familiar, easy. Her use of Mr. Vance for him was a wall, deliberate and clear. That was a long time ago. Julian corrected, feeling an inexplicable need to sever that connection to a past he'd buried. I don't have time for things like that anymore. The words sounded hollow, even to him. Elena's eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, held his for a fraction of a second too long. That's a shame, she said, her voice soft, but carrying an edge of judgment that was as sharp as it was quiet. Everyone needs time for what makes them human. Before he could formulate a response, she turned her attention back to Arthur. "All right, Mr. Hemingway. That's enough adventure for one afternoon. Your blood pressure medication is due, and you need to rest before dinner." She moved with a gentle authority that left no room for argument. As she guided Arthur toward a bench, Julian found himself speaking, trying to reclaim control. "This community garden you're involved with." He began remembering his grandfather's proud words. "It's admirable work. The Vance Legacy Fund regularly supports such initiatives. I can have my people contact you." He expected a flicker of excitement, of gratitude. It was the reaction he always got. A check from his foundation could solve any problem. But Elena stopped and looked at him, and the polite mask was gone. In its place was a quiet fire. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Vance, but we're not an initiative. We're a neighborhood," she said, her voice still low, but now laced with steel. "We don't need a check to make us feel better about the state of the world. We need hands in the soil. We need people to show up. Money is easy. Showing up is hard." She had, in the space of a sentence, dismantled his entire power structure. She hadn't just rejected his money. She had deemed it irrelevant, a cheap substitute for actual humanity. He was dismissed. An hour later, Julian was standing in his penthouse, a glass of scotch in his hand, the city sprawling beneath him like a carpet of diamonds. He had closed a 9-figure merger that morning, without breaking a sweat, yet he felt profoundly unsettled by a 5-minute conversation with a care home worker. Money is easy. Showing up is hard. The words echoed in the vast, empty space of his apartment, a space filled with priceless art, but devoid of life. He looked at his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, a perfectly tailored suit, a face set in a mask of control. He felt a sudden violent urge to shatter it. Instead, he set his glass down, walked over to his sleek minimalist desk, and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind screaming at him to stop, to get back to the stock tickers and acquisition reports, to the world where he was king. But it was too late. He typed the words that felt like a betrayal to everything he had built. Elena Morales. Community garden. The search results populated in an instant, but the website they led to felt like it was from another era. There was no sleek user interface, no corporate branding, just a simple page titled Race's Community Garden. Roots. He clicked on the photo gallery. It wasn't filled with posed shots of donors or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It was a chaotic, vibrant collage of life. Children with dirt-caked hands holding up misshapen carrots, an elderly couple sharing a bench surrounded by sunflowers, teenagers building a compost bin. And there, in the middle of it all, was Elena. In one photo, she was laughing, head thrown back, a streak of mud on her cheek, as a little boy proudly showed her a worm. Her hair was a wild halo escaping a worn bandana. Her eyes shone with a light no professional photographer could ever capture. Julian found himself staring, completely captivated. He had dated supermodels, heiresses, women who were considered the most beautiful in the world, but none of them had ever looked as real, as truly alive as Elena did in that picture. The image was still burned into his mind the next evening, as he stood on a rooftop bar so exclusive it didn't even have a sign. "Jules, darling, I was beginning to think you'd stood us up." Catherine Davenport glided to his side, a vision in red silk. She was the daughter of a rival private equity titan, and the unspoken consensus among their circle was that their eventual union would be less a marriage and more a dynastic merger. "You seem a million miles away," she murmured, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm. "Just thinking about a visit I paid to my grandfather." He said the words, feeling like a test. Catherine's smile was flawless and utterly devoid of warmth. "How sweet of you to check in on the old guard. It's so important to maintain those traditions." She made his grandfather sound like a dusty museum piece. As she launched into a monologue about a potential acquisition in Europe, Julian felt a profound disconnect, as if he were watching a movie of his own life. The clinking glasses, the strategic laughter, the predatory smiles. It was all a stage, and he was tired of his role. He left early, offering a vague excuse that Catherine accepted with a look that said she knew it was a lie. But instead of driving home to his silent penthouse, he found himself keying the address of the race's community garden into his car's navigation. The Aston Martin purred through the sleeping city, crossing invisible lines into a neighborhood where the streetlights were a little dimmer and the buildings were closer together. He parked in the shadows across from a chain-link fence, enclosing a dark, silent plot of land. Of course it was locked. What had he expected? That she'd be here tending to plants by moonlight? He felt a surge of self-loathing. He was a fool, a titan of industry, spying on his grandfather's nurse because she was the first person in a decade who hadn't been impressed by him. He was about to drive away when a door opened at the community center across the street. A small group of people spilled out, their laughter echoing in the quiet night. And even in the dim light, he knew her silhouette instantly. It was Elena. She hugged an older woman, then clapped a young man on the shoulder, their camaraderie easy and genuine. Julian sank lower in the plush leather of his seat, an invisible man in a multi-million-dollar cage. He watched her get into a modest sedan and drive away, leaving him alone in the dark, surrounded by all his wealth, and suffocated by a poverty of the soul he was only just beginning to understand. The drive back to his penthouse that night was a blur. The city lights, usually a symbol of his power, seemed to mock him, highlighting the profound emptiness of his gilded cage. The next morning, the numbers on his screen swam before his eyes, meaningless. The phantom image of Elena laughing in a world he couldn't access had become an obsession. He picked up his private line, the one reserved for kings and presidents, and dialed the front desk at Serenity Gardens. "I'd like to visit my grandfather this afternoon," he said before adding, his voice dropping slightly. "I was just wondering, what time does Ms. Morales' shift typically end?" It was a breach of his own protocol, a step into uncharted territory. He found them in the sun-drenched recreation room. Elena wasn't in the garden. She was leading an art class. A dozen residents, including his grandfather, were hunched over watercolors. The scene was so foreign, so deeply out of his element, that his first instinct was to retreat. But Arthur spotted him and waved a huge childlike grin on his face. "Jules, come paint with us." Before he knew it, Elena was guiding him to an empty seat, a polite but challenging glint in her eye. "Today's theme is a place that means something special," she said, placing a blank sheet of paper in front of him. In his $1,000 suit, surrounded by the smell of paint and cheerful chatter, Julian felt more vulnerable than he had during any hostile takeover. With hesitant strokes, he began to paint a memory he'd long suppressed: a wobbly dock, 2 fishing poles, the silhouette of a man and a boy against a setting sun. Later, as he walked with his grandfather by the pond, Arthur studied him with shrewd eyes. "She's gotten under your skin, hasn't she?" Julian didn't answer. "She reminds me of your grandmother," Arthur said softly. "You know the story your mother always told about her being from a banking family. That was a fabrication. I met your grandmother when she was a waitress in a 24-hour diner. She served me coffee, saw I looked like my world had ended, and told me to stop taking myself so seriously." Arthur paused, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a beautiful, heavy gold pocket watch and pressed it into Julian's hand. "This belonged to my father. It's a Vance family heirloom." Julian looked down at it. The watch was ornate, magnificent, but the hands were frozen. "It stopped working in 1958. Arthur said, his voice heavy with meaning. "The year he made the hardest, most regrettable decision of his career. I've always felt our family's time has been stuck since that day. Maybe you can be the one to get it ticking again." The weight of the watch in his palm felt like the weight of a hidden history. Before he left, he found Elena, who was quietly pruning roses in the garden. He stood there for a moment, the broken watch a cold secret in his pocket. He wasn't the king of the city anymore. He was just a man with a fractured legacy. "Elena." He began, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up, surprised. "You told me money is easy, and showing up is hard." He took a breath, letting go of a lifetime of pride. You said you need hands in the soil. I know they're not used to it, but mine are available." Her pruning shears went still. Her eyes, which had been so hard on him before now, held a flicker of stunned disbelief. She studied his face, his expensive shoes on the dirt path, the desperation he couldn't hide. It was a preposterous offer, a billionaire wanting to weed a garden. Every rational thought told her to laugh, to send him back to his world of glass towers and empty promises. But the look in his eyes wasn't a game. It was a plea. He looked from the pathetic duct-taped pipe to Elena's guarded face, and a battle raged within him. The old Julian, the king of spreadsheets and swift solutions, screamed at him to just write the check. $2,000 was less than a rounding error to him. It was the cost of the wine he'd had with lunch yesterday. He could solve her problem in 5 seconds and earn her gratitude. But he knew with a gut-level certainty that it would be the wrong move. It would be a transaction, and what he was starting to feel for this woman, for this place, was anything but transactional. He met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting a sincerity he hadn't known he possessed. "My grandfather once told me a business should be measured by the good. It does not just the profit it makes." He said the words feeling new and true on his tongue. "You're running a business here, Elena. The product is hope, and your infrastructure is failing." He took a step closer. "Writing a check is the easy way. It's what I would have done last week. But you taught me that easy isn't the point." He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Let me help. Not with my money, but with my time. My entire life is built on strategy, on finding capital, on making a case to investors. Let me see your budget. Let me see the quotes you've gotten for the new system. Let's build a real plan." The offer hung in the air between them, more shocking to her than if he'd offered $1 million. He was offering his most valuable asset, not his fortune, but his mind. A few evenings later, the two of them were huddled over a stack of papers in the garden's tiny cramped shed that served as an office. The space smelled of soil and damp wood, a world away from his leather and mahogany office downtown. For Julian, it felt more real. They discovered the problem was deeper than a simple shortfall. The grant applications were a labyrinth of bureaucratic red tape, designed for organizations with professional grant writers, not for community volunteers. Local businesses they'd approached were hesitant, offering polite refusals that all amounted to the same thing: their neighborhood wasn't a priority. Julian felt a hot surge of anger. He saw for the first time the invisible walls his world had built to keep communities like Elena's struggling. "This system," he said, slamming a denied grant application on the desk, "it's designed for you to fail." Elena just gave a wry, tired smile. "Welcome to my world, Julian." It was in that moment of shared frustration that an idea sparked in his mind. "Then we stop playing their game," he said, his voice electric with sudden energy. "We stop asking. We start creating. We'll host a fundraiser, right here in the garden. A races to table dinner. We'll get local chefs to donate their time-use produce from right here. We'll sell tickets. We'll build a story. We won't be a charity case. We'll be the hottest ticket in town." As he spoke, he saw the weariness in Elena's eyes replaced by a dawning excitement. It was a synthesis of their two worlds. His strategic, ambitious thinking paired with her grassroots authenticity. As they brainstormed, laughing and sketching out plans on a napkin, his phone buzzed. It was a calendar alert from his assistant. Reminder: confirm guest list for Vance Legacy Fund Gala. The name of the event hit him like a splash of cold water, a reminder of the other life that was still waiting for him. The world of performative charity, of Catherine Davenport, of expectations and legacy. He looked at Elena, her face alive with passion for their new plan, and he made an impulsive, terrifying decision. "Speaking of fundraisers," he said, trying to sound casual, "my company hosts one every year, a black tie gala. It's next month." He watched her face carefully. "I know it's not your world. In fact, it's the opposite of this. But I want you to see it. I want you to be there, with me." The joyous energy in the small shed vanished. Elena's smile faded, replaced by the guarded assessing look he remembered from their first meeting. A gala. A black tie event. It represented the very system of opulent wealth and hollow gestures they had just been railing against. He had asked her to step out of her world of dirt and authenticity and into his cage of gold and glass. Her silence was his answer, and it was deafening. The silence in the small shed was a universe. Julian could almost hear the war waging inside Elena's mind. He had, in his carelessness, swung the conversation from their shared hopeful future to his gilded, complicated past. He watched her retreat into herself, the walls he had worked so hard to dismantle being rebuilt, brick by brick. He was about to apologize to take it all back when she finally spoke, her voice quiet, but unyielding. "All right," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'll go." Julian's heart leaped, but she held up a hand, cutting off his relief. "But let's be clear about one thing. I'm not going to be one of the polished ornaments you hang on your arm. I don't own a gala dress. I don't know which fork to use. I'm going as me. And if that's a problem, tell me now." It was a dare, a final test. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "that's the only way I want you to go." The night of the Vance Legacy Fund Gala was a spectacle of calculated extravagance. Julian stood near the grand entrance, a king in his own kingdom, but his eyes kept darting toward the parade of limousines, his anxiety a stark contrast to his calm exterior. Then, a modest sedan, a decade old, and dwarfed by the luxury vehicles around it, pulled up to the valet. Elena stepped out. She wore a simple dark blue gown that flowed without fanfare, her hair swept up in an elegant but unfussy style. In a sea of diamonds and designer labels, her understated grace was a revelation. To Julian, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "You look real," he breathed, taking her hand. "I feel like an imposter," she whispered back, her eyes wide, as she took in the cavernous ballroom, the crystal chandeliers, the string quartet. "How much of the money they raised tonight," she murmured, her activist mind always working, "actually makes it to the children after paying for all of this?" It was a question he had never once thought to ask. Before he could answer, they were intercepted by Catherine Davenport. She was a vision in blood-red couture, her smile sharp and possessive as she looked at Julian, then let her gaze sweep over Elena with chilling dismissiveness. "Jules, darling. And this must be your new friend." Catherine purred her tone, making Elena sound like a stray Julian had picked up. "Elena Morales." Elena said, her voice steady, as she extended a hand Catherine pointedly ignored. "It's so noble what you do." Catherine continued, linking her arm through Julian's. "Julian is just the same, always so concerned with giving back. You two must have so much to talk about." The implication was clear. Elena was a project, not a peer. Later, after an excruciating dinner spent deflecting polite but invasive questions, Julian pulled Elena onto the dance floor. "I'm sorry," he murmured, holding her close. "For her. For all of this." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's not you, Julian. It's the world. It's so loud. And everything is a performance." He held her tighter, swaying to the music, creating a tiny island for just the two of them in the middle of the glittering sea. "You make it quiet," he confessed. "You make everything else just noise." He looked down at her, and the rest of the world finally faded away. He leaned in, and she met him halfway, a soft, tender kiss that was a promise and a prayer in the middle of a battlefield. It was perfect. And then it was broken. "Julian, I'm so sorry to interrupt." Catherine was there, her smile a brittle mask. "But the governor is leaving, and he insists on having a word with you about the waterfront development. It's urgent." Julian hesitated, torn. "Go," Elena urged softly. "It's okay. I'll be right here." Reluctantly, he let her go and followed Catherine across the floor. As soon as he was out of earshot, Catherine's work was done. She melted back into the crowd, leaving Elena standing alone. And from the shadows, a new figure approached. It was one of the older, influential board members, a man who had been at Julian's father's side for decades. He smiled at Elena, a kind, fatherly smile. "You seem like a lovely girl." He began, his voice gentle. "But you need to understand something about the Vance family. The legacy is everything. A man like Julian can't afford a distraction. He needs a partner, not a project." The old man's words, delivered with such paternalistic poison, were a far more brutal blow than Catherine's open hostility. He wasn't just calling her an outsider. He was calling her a liability, a flaw in the grand design of the Vance legacy. In that moment, Elena felt the crushing, invisible weight of an entire system designed to reject her. She didn't cry or argue. With a quiet dignity that was its own form of rebellion, she simply nodded, turned, and walked away, melting out of the ballroom and into the night. She sent Julian a single polite text. "Not feeling well. Had to leave. Thank you for the evening." The formal tone was a goodbye colder than any angry words could ever be. When Julian returned to find her gone, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The text message confirmed his fear. He found the old board member Walter by the champagne fountain, smiling contentedly. "Where is she?" Julian's voice was dangerously low. Walter feigned innocence. "The little nurse? A bit overwhelmed, I imagine. I simply offered some fatherly advice, my boy. For the good of the company. For the good of the legacy." The confession, so smug and self-assured, ignited a fury in Julian so pure it burned away every last vestige of the man he used to be. He drove through the city, the broken pocket watch in his pocket, feeling like a lead weight. When he knocked on Elena's door, long after midnight, she opened it to find a man she barely recognized. The polished CEO was gone, replaced by someone raw, desperate, and utterly resolved. "They're not protecting a legacy, Elena," he said, his voice ragged as he stepped into her small, warm apartment. "They're protecting a lie." He told her everything. About the watch that stopped in 1958. About the secret Arthur had confessed, the ugly truth of how Vance Holdings was built on the displacement of a community. Her community. That gala, that charity. He said with disgust, "It isn't about giving back. It's about forgetting. It's a monument to a crime." He took her hands. "I don't want that legacy. I want to build a new one. I want to fix what my family broke. But I can't do it alone. They see you as a project, a distraction. But they're wrong. You're not the distraction, Elena. You're the purpose." In his eyes, she saw not a billionaire trying to win an argument, but a man trying to save his own soul. And she believed him. The emergency board meeting was a storm of quiet violence. Catherine and Walter, confident in their numbers, initiated the vote of no confidence. Julian let them. Then, when it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He laid a single yellow document on the mahogany table, the original 1958 land seizure order. A stunned silence fell over the room. He revealed his knowledge of the cover-up, then laid out his ultimatum, not a threat, but a proposal. The Vance Restoration Project. A massive, irrevocable investment to rebuild the very community his family had fractured, overseen by a new foundation with community members on its board. It was checkmate. To refuse was to risk total exposure. He watched the blood drain from Walter's face, and the confident smirk vanish from Catherine's. One by one, he secured the votes, not just to lead, but to fundamentally remake the company and its board. 2 months later, the Races community garden was aglow with string lights. The first Races to Table fundraiser was a resounding success, a joyous, chaotic celebration of community. Julian stood with Elena, watching his grandfather Arthur animatedly judging a pie contest with Sophia. He pulled Elena away to a quiet corner under the shade of an old oak tree. "My family broke something a long time ago," he said softly. "And ever since I met you, I feel like I've been trying to fix it. To fix myself." He knelt down on the soft soil, not caring about the dirt staining his jeans. He didn't pull out a diamond the size of a fist. Instead, he opened his palm to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Elena Morales, you taught me that a legacy isn't what you own, it's what you build. Will you build a new one with me? Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a cheer erupted from their friends and family who had been watching. Later, as the party wound down, he pulled the old gold watch from his pocket. He wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or the hope thrumming in his own heart, but he could have sworn he saw the second hand twitch just once, as if time for the Vance family was finally starting again. 1 year later, the air at the grand opening of the Vance Morales Community Center was thrumming with music, laughter, and the rich smell of barbecue. This place, which a year ago was just a weed-choked empty lot next to the garden, was now a modern light-filled building, with a library, a community kitchen, and classrooms. The Vance Restoration Project was no longer an idea on paper. It was a living, breathing entity, changing lives. Julian stood off to the side, not in a power suit, but in a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was currently being defeated in a game of chess by a 10-year-old girl, and he had never been happier. He was no longer a distant savior, a benefactor descending from on high. He was Jules, the guy who had hauled bags of soil with them, the one who listened to their stories, the one who had become part of the fabric of the community. Elena, in her role as the foundation's executive director, stood at the podium. She was no longer just a nurse or a solitary activist. She was now a powerful voice, a respected leader, yet her eyes held the same warmth and steadfast resolve. She spoke of numbers, not of profits, but of the number of children being tutored, of elders receiving hot meals, of teens who had found jobs through the center's programs. Arthur Vance, sitting in the front row beside Sophia, looked 10 years younger. He was the library's most beloved storyteller. The legacy he had once feared had rotted was now being reborn day by day before his very eyes. In the middle of the ceremony, a reporter from a major business journal found Julian. "Mr. Vance," the reporter asked with a cynical smile, "some critics suggest this is just the most expensive apology in corporate history. What do you say to the idea that this is still in essence a sophisticated PR stunt?" The old Julian would have countered with cold hard data, but the Julian of today simply smiled. Before he could even respond, Elena had moved to his side, her hand resting gently on his back. "An apology is just words." Elena answered for him, her voice clear and firm, directed at the reporter. "This is a classroom. That is a garden providing fresh food for over 50 families. PR can't teach a child to read. Profit can't build trust. We aren't erasing the past. We are trying to build a better future from it. Would you like a tour of the kitchen?" The reporter was speechless. Julian looked at Elena with a love and admiration so profound it felt like it could power the entire city. They were a team. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, the two of them stood alone in the quiet garden, under the soft glow of the new community center's lights. Julian took the gold pocket watch from his pocket. It had remained silent in his pocket for a year, a quiet, constant reminder. "I've been thinking a lot about time," he said, his voice low and warm. "About how it can stop, how it can be frozen by mistakes. And I realized time doesn't start again on its own. We have to wind it ourselves together." He gently turned the small crown on the side of the watch. A soft click echoed in the quiet air. And then, a miraculous sound he had been waiting a year to hear. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The second hand was moving. Slowly, steadily, and full of life. The Vance family's time was no longer frozen in the past. Elena leaned her head on his shoulder, and they both listened to the rhythm of time, to the heartbeat of a new legacy they had built together from love, forgiveness, and hands that were not afraid to get dirty. The work was still ahead of them, but tonight, under the stars, they knew they had found their way home.